Hi, Katy. Thank you so much for joining me today. I want to introduce you to everyone. Katy Manganella is a licensed professional counselor and an RYT 200. Katy worked in homeless services prior to practice in teaching yoga. So, Katy, where I want to start right off the bat is actually asking you about something we talked previously about. You told me about a yoga group that you do
Yeah.
at Austin. Where is that?
I team up with the Center for Grief and Loss in Austin and do a therapeutic yoga group with them. It's a 7-week long series that we offer a few times a year. That's really focused on how to process grief through the physical body.
I love how even just how you word that, process grief through the physical body.
Mm-hmm.
Could
Yeah,
you go
go
ahead?
ahead. What were you going to ask me to elaborate
Uh,
on that?
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So uh, it's interesting that you point out the wording on that. Um, there's a few pieces there that come up, right? The first piece I think that's significant is the word process, because everything that we're doing, right, is a constant process, but particularly with grief. And there's not necessarily an endpoint in your grief, right? So approaching it and framing it through the lens of this is a process, it's going to help you move through the process. It, I think, helps to relieve the expectation that it's going to end. The other piece is the physical body, which feels important because that group in particular is almost exclusively physical movement with a very small portion, like 10 minutes at the end, of verbal processing. But the verbal processing is about what you notice in your physical body and any shifts that you might have experienced mentally or emotionally in your grief through the physical practice. But I think helping to separate out that we process our emotions not just mentally, but also through our physical body, and these two are interconnected, I think provides, first of all, it's psychoeducation, right? The physical body and the mental body they're connected, but also that you can access parts of your healing process through your physical body.
I love how you can make these distinctions between process versus something that you check off the list as, okay, that's done and moving on. Which leads me straight into a question I have for you is what are some of the common misconceptions that you encounter that people have about grief or about healing in general, such as thinking, okay, I can just do the 5-step plan, and then be done.
Tell me what to do. How do I think this through in a way that makes it feel better? I think that's one of the misconceptions right there, right? Is that there is something that we're supposed to do, or there are like set steps for moving through. I mean, grief is one example. I think grief is a really actually poignant example because the Kubler-Ross's stages of grief are so well known that at first glance it looks like, all right, so I start with denial, and then I move into blank, and then I move into blank, and I'm already at anger. So if I'm at anger and I'm now experiencing denial again, doesn't that mean that I have regressed? And it's like that's where this whole misconception that grief or emotional healing is linear comes from, right? Because it's not. So I think that's the first one, is that it's actually a much more fluid process rather than a structured framework. And I tell folks this too, right? When they come in for therapy, if you could find the steps to making this feel better, you would have already found it on the internet, right? So that the part that's missing is not that you don't have the information, but maybe that you haven't felt it through.
That piece where you said, does this mean that I've regressed and then I'm not making progress?
Mm-hmm.
I know that that's a question that I hear too in other settings or about other things as well in terms of emotional healing.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it, do you think, that that is so common, that is such a common mindset that we have when we're in this process of healing, to wonder if we're backsliding.
Yeah. The first thing that comes up for me with that is, well, first of all, when we're in emotional distress, be that grief or anxiety or depression or relationship distress or low self-esteem, whatever it is, whatever emotional distress that someone might be experiencing, it's very unpleasant, right? So folks come in with a sense of urgency. They want relief, and for good reason. And the fear is that I won't get better, or I'm going to feel like this forever. And so we look for signs that that might be true, because our brains are designed to spot out vulnerabilities to keep us safe, right? So, yeah, you're going to notice, oh my God, I'm like experiencing a symptom that I used to experience that I haven't had in a long time. And does that mean that I'm regressing and that my fear that I won't get better might be true? I think the other piece that comes up for me is that we're very achievement based as a culture. We're very like, tell me what the thing is that I'm supposed to do, and I will do it and I will achieve it. And that gets really easily tied to doing a good job, quote unquote. And that if I am not seeing linear progress, I am doing something wrong, which gets very complicated very quickly if that's tied to how you like value yourself as a human being. If you're someone who is very like achievement focused, that becomes even more complicated if you feel like you're not making progress in your own healing.
I love how you're pointing out just one is this is multifaceted, and with that piece of how our brains are designed to be on the lookout for threats and how we might be hurt more than we already have, it makes sense. It makes sense that we would be thinking, uh-oh, am I regressing? That's not bad. That's not weird.
No. Like, isn't that what you want your brain to do? Right? Like we want our brains to protect us. Sometimes it goes into overdrive, which I think we commonly experience that is anxiety. Like my brain is overactive, looking for perceived threats and trying to problem solve every what if scenario. Like, what if I can't get better? What if I'm going to feel like this forever? What if I'm somehow actually broken? Like, what if my brain actually can't heal? I hear that sometimes. Like, what if I have permanent damage? And it makes sense. It makes sense why somebody would be worried that they're going to feel that way forever.
Yeah. What do you say in response to that question? Like, what if my brain is broken? What if I'm too far gone?
You know, what I do, I don't know what other people do. What I do is I try to fight my urge to fix it for them and instead try to join them in it and validate, like, that must be such a terrifying thought, right? Like, so I try to join the folks that I work with in it. Like, let's talk about what it feels like to be in that place. It's where you are right now. And then after they have fully felt that, help them look for evidence that it's not true, right? Because our brains get really black and white, especially when we're catastrophizing or thinking the worst case scenario might be true, right? So if you can help to shed any gray into a black and white, like, what if I can't get better? What if I'm broken? Like, there's nothing I can do. If you can help someone identify for themselves data that they have that's not true, good days that they've had, progress that they've made, times when they don't feel like this, that all disproves the fear.
But I love how you start with, that must be terrifying to have that thought. Right then, when you say that, that person is able to go, not alone in this thought. Someone's seeing that I'm feeling this. Someone's understanding a little bit about what it's like for me to be in this spot.
Yeah, not trying to run away from it, right? Because when we have those types of thoughts, what we try to do is we try to shut them down because they're really big. and we try to like distract ourselves or avoid the thought entirely or the feeling entirely. And really, when we turn and face it, it becomes so much more manageable. It's not dissimilar. I will use this metaphor with clients, or the example, I guess, with clients that, when you're watching a scary movie and there's this monster, Stranger Things is a good example of this on Netflix, right? Like the whole idea that there's this monster thing is terrifying. And the kids are all running from it for like 2 seasons. And then they turn around and they face it. And it's like, oh, that's it. Like suddenly like the fear goes down and it becomes this thing that's like you start to think through, how do I respond to this as opposed to how do I outrun this? And that's what happens when we sit with our scariest and biggest emotions too.
Wow, how do I respond to this instead of run from it?
Mm-hmm.
That does feel really different.
It does. It's much more empowering.
Are there certain points of healing that, I don't know if you would say objective points of healing, because it's so personal and specific for everyone, but are there certain points and certain thresholds of where someone can feel good about, okay, because I'm at this point, there's something about it that provides a greater sense of security than where I've been before?
Yeah, there's a lot there. The first thing that comes up for me when I think about that question is thinking about a hierarchy of needs, right? And that we have like these lower order needs that have to be met before we can move into higher order needs. Like, for example, if I don't have security and shelter, food, and water, I can't think about how to self-actualize. What's my life purpose? How am I going to become that thing? Right. So I think if you look at the framework of the hierarchy of needs, then you do see like at certain points you do get to like level up, right? Because your lower order needs are being met and you can move into your higher order needs. I don't know. I mean, honestly, now that I'm thinking about it, it doesn't feel, it's actually what we were saying in the beginning. It's not that linear, right? Like as you're experiencing it with someone, it's like they start to gain some of their power back and their belief in themselves. And this is like true across whatever the problem is, right? Like I start to feel better, and then the ball starts to roll on its own. And that momentum makes it easier, right? But what that means that you can achieve, I think, is so personal. For some people, it's like I now have the belief in myself that like I'm leaving this relationship where I've been emotionally abused and I'm quitting the job that has made me miserable, or whatever it is that they need to unlock to move on in their lives. They now have they believe they have the resilience. The resilience is probably there, but they didn't know that to move forward.
Yeah. So one signpost is that belief, the belief in themselves and then in their resilience. And that is something that changes everything.
Right.
And it sounds like a direction or a movement or a change in pattern that is the thing that is really significantly different. And there is a question that comes up of like, well, could someone go back to where they were of not believing in their resilience and not moving in the new ways that they learned to?
Absolutely. Right? Like, and I think that's what makes not just the work of therapy exciting, but like the work of being a human being exciting is like I actively choose stuff all the time that I know is not really in my best interest, right? Like, and then I get to witness what happens next, and I get to choose if I want to get back onto the other path that I was on. Of course, we backslide, quote unquote, into old ways of being or old thought patterns. And I think for me, what comes up with that is how do I have a compassionate response to myself when it happens, as opposed to having a shaming response? And what I mean by that is like, how do I observe with curiosity? Like, oh, interesting. I wonder why I'm choosing to do X, Y, or Z, or why did I text my ex? Like I knew what I was going to get in response. Why did I do that? And really coming at it from a curiosity place, as opposed to like what is wrong with me that I keep choosing these terrible things for myself. I think that's a critical component to healing, is that piece of self-compassion, which you and I have talked about a little bit already, just that being loving with yourself is so important.
I want to ask about some more about self-compassion, but before we get there, this idea is coming to my mind where it's almost as if the backsliding or the going back to the old pattern we knew is to be expected, that it's a part of what it is to be human and what it is to be in a process of healing.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's not linear. And as we move more into a place of curiosity and observing ourselves, almost like we're removed from ourselves, right? Like really being curious about what urges am I feeling? Where might that be coming from? What unmet needs might that be telling me that I have today? What are my options for meeting those needs? It moves us into a place of being able to respond versus like react, right? So react would be I act on my first impulse, which is probably going to be a reflection of how you've handled things in the past, because that's what your brain knows and is most familiar with. Versus responding slows down the process, looks at what's coming up and says, what are my options for how do I respond to this? And maybe, go with your first impulse. No judgment if you do. And then you get to see what happens next.
There's this movement towards responding. And I like how you point out that just because we're moving towards responding doesn't mean that we reject reacting, or that we say reacting is a bad thing.
Right. It's empowering to feel like I can still choose to do the thing that I don't want to do, or I know is not in my best interest, if that makes sense. So kind of building or, following that same line of thought about somebody texting their ex, right? Like I might know that that's really not the direction I want to go in, but I can still choose to text that person. But it's much more empowering when I'm making a conscious choice to do it versus I now have been engaged in some text conversation that doesn't feel good for me. And I'm like, how the hell did I even get here? What was I thinking? And now you're thinking through the choice in hindsight, as opposed to I'm making a conscious choice to do this thing right now, even if I know that I might regret it.
It sounds like resilience. I can end up anywhere and I'll be okay.
Right. Yeah. And it's not, if I make a mistake, it's okay. Right. Like I say this phrase that mistakes are good opportunities to learn. So instead of our very natural response is to shame mistakes and feel like something is wrong with us. And if instead we look at it as, again, through this lens of like curiosity, then you can learn a lot and apply it moving forward.
Yeah. I want to kind of jump to, for you, when did things change for you towards
living more
trying
mindfully
out these things?
It's been on and off for a very long time, if I'm being fully honest. I think I started this work probably my mid-ish 20s. And then just to like self-disclose. So I worked in homeless services for a long time, like 6 or 7 years, something like that. And in that work, there's an overwhelming need and not enough resources, be that financial or people or what, not enough resources in any sense of the word to meet the level of need. And so in that field, I really became all consumed. I, not consciously, I quit practicing the things that I knew worked for me. I became really burnt out, very jaded, and was experiencing such a high level of stress that I couldn't even recognize that that's what I was experiencing. I was just crying most days, which no judgment in crying. But when you're crying every day leaving work, there's something wrong.
I'm like imagining you looking back at that time and going, huh.
Oh, it's like, talk about shame coming up. I'm like, what in the... Yeah, so I remember, yes. So what ended up happening was, after living like this for a number of years, a yoga studio actually opened up in my neighborhood, and I had done yoga on YouTube, like in the evenings, like 11 p.m. or something, as I'm getting ready for bed, like 10 minutes, all I could squeeze in for my self-care. It was a dire state of mind. This yoga studio opened up, and I remember being so nervous to go to a public yoga class. Like, I had not even taken a yoga video that was longer than 20 minutes, and I'm about to go to a heated yoga class for an hour. And I remember after my first class, like, I will never forget it. And I actually talked to that yoga teacher years later. Like, that changed the course of my life. I left that day feeling like, I don't even have words to describe what physically released through my body doing that one yoga class. And that started to gain momentum on its own. And so what I would end up doing is I would leave work crying and go to the yoga studio every day at 6:00, and I would take a yoga class, and I started to really get back in touch with myself. And it was through the physical body that I started to do this emotional healing. And that's really when, and that's been a few years now, that I changed directions in my career. Actually ended up leaving homeless services, really being intentional about how do I build a life for myself that's working better for me. And that was all accessible to me through my physical body. And that was, years after grad school. So I had the training as a therapist. I knew these things. We talked about this before. I knew these things academically, but I hadn't experienced them, right? And it was through the physical body work of yoga that I got back in touch with myself.
You didn't learn this academically. You didn't learn getting back in touch with yourself.
Mm-mm.
And using your body to be able to do that.
Yeah. And that the two are connected, right? And I think I probably, knew that academically, that the physical body and the mind are connected. I mean, I'm sure I knew that, but I hadn't experienced it. And it's really interesting. I don't know, this sounds cliche and dramatic. I don't know where I would be if I hadn't gone to yoga. I mean, truly, like, I might still be in that field crying every day when I leave work. I really don't know. The physical body was what opened up so much more for me on my own path of healing.
Yeah. And knowing what you knew from grad school and having theories and ideas and information in your brain, like you said, you probably did know some of what you're saying that you now know, mm-hmm. But it's just that this knowing is different.
Yeah. Experiential learning is much different than academic learning.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's, again, not dissimilar to what we were talking about in the beginning of our conversation, where it's, you could tell me all the steps, but unless I sit with and experience the steps, it doesn't really matter.
And even this whole conversation that we're having, all the ideas or all the things of talking about healing and resilience and empowerment, like what is empowering and what is helpful. All these things can stay just as ideas in our heads until we experience it.
Yeah, until we experience it. And then it gains momentum on its own, right? Because I'll speak for myself, before I could articulate what was happening, my body knew that something was changing. And like, it felt so good, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally, that I kept going back to it because it was like, this is so good for me. And it was truly like the experience of it that was leading the way. It wasn't like, I know this is the right thing to do because like I read an article on it. It's like my body is telling me to go to yoga. Like that's what feels the very best for me right now.
So that night, it was 6 p.m. It was your first time to go to an in-person yoga class.
Yeah.
And even the longest you had done at home on your own was like 10, 20 minutes. Mm-hmm. And so there's that part of it that was daunting. And you go, it's heated. Do you remember what type of class it was or what?
It was a vinyasa class, which with Rachel Frank at Black Swan Yoga. And she's intense. It was an intense yoga class. I remember it was intense. It was also dark in the room, which I remember being so relieved by because I'm like, oh, well, at least nobody can see me, you know? And again, I think that's so much of that achievement brain. Like, if I'm going to do this, I better be good at it. And I better be able to make it the full hour. Otherwise, how embarrassing. You know, it's just like, it's such a shaming mentality and an achievement-based mentality that honestly just constantly made me feel like I wasn't good enough and that it wasn't okay for me to show up unless I could be the best at something, or at least one of the best at something. And it's a very limiting mindset, right? And I think part of what I found through yoga, and I think this can be true in other modalities of physical movement as well, but particularly through yoga, there's this movement right now to move your body in a way that feels good and do what works for you, and that what your teacher gives you as a suggestion as opposed to a regimen that you need to follow. And so it gives a lot of permission to show up imperfectly, to rest when you need to rest, to do what your body needs to do, what it's telling you it wants to do, to listen to your body, which is like a wild concept.
That first class that you took, I'm getting the idea that was one that was intense and maybe not as, hey, do it feels good.
Yeah.
I mean, do you recall her words or her tone or anything that stood out to you that first class?
I don't recall many specifics. I remember that she had really great music and she cussed when she taught, which made the class feel very casual. It was intense. I mean, that particular studio is very, most of their classes are higher intensity and more physical fitness oriented, as opposed to movement that is more for emotional healing. And so I think what's interesting, and I'm only now realizing this as we're talking about it, is even though that was a workout class that I took, like the components of healing through the physical body were still there, right? So now, as I teach yoga, I don't teach like a workout class. It's much more of it's a physical healing, but the same things that make that work were present in that very random 6 p.m. public yoga class that I dropped into.
Would it be right, this idea that I have, or accurate at all, that the types of classes that you teach, there's a lot of connection happening of all the different parts of the person showing up.
Yeah.
And then I have this idea about this intense class where it may not have been about connecting all the pieces, but there's an emotional processing that happened in that moment.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think as I have gotten further into understanding the connection between the brain and the body, like literally trying to understand like what connects these two things together and how is it that they talk to each other, more complex than I will ever fully understand. I have learned that so our brains and our bodies are connected through our nervous system, right? Like long story short, and they communicate to each other. And a lot of that communication is through the vagus nerve, which is the largest nerve from your brain to your abdomen. It's like quite literally your brain and your gut are talking to each other. The fibers of that nerve, this is so cool. I like totally geek out on this. I think it's 80% of the fibers are going from your brain into your abdomen, and 20% are going from your abdomen up to your brain, right? So there's this circuit of information that's happening. And when we soothe the physical body and we soothe the nervous system, that sends information to our brain that we are safe and that we can relax, right? And that's where we experience the mental and the emotional shifts. Understanding just a fraction of like how is that actually working? What is that loop actually like? I think helps me to understand what's happening for myself when I'm practicing yoga or moving my body in whatever way I am wanting to move it that day. And when I teach a yoga class, it's a lot of that too, right? Like helping people to understand that their brains and their bodies are talking to each other, and that when we're showing up on our yoga mats, we're approaching healing again through the physical body. But this, you will experience mental and emotional shifts because of the connectedness.
Feeling safe and feeling relaxed.
Mm-hmm.
From what you're saying, it sounds so simple. Feeling safe, feeling relaxed, but feeling those things does so much.
So much.
What is that about? Why does feeling safe
matter? Oh my God. I'm like getting so excited talking about this. All right. Going back to the hierarchy of needs. If I don't feel safe, I can't do anything else. I can't access anything else if I don't feel safe. All right. So feeling safe is like a prerequisite for doing anything unless you're in survival mode. Right. So if we're feeling unsafe, and I think it's important to even peel that back a little bit, right? Like there's physical unsafety, but there can also be mental or emotional unsafety. We're going to be living in a state of fight, flight, or freeze, right? Because our nervous systems are activated and preparing for like needing to protect us. That pumps adrenaline through your system, that increases your heart rate, it makes your stomach fluttery, it clenches your chest, it does all kinds of stuff to start protecting our physical body because the brain does not feel safe. So if we can kind of reverse hack that, if you will, and we can soothe the physical body, it like opens up all this safety in the brain, which then makes everything else possible.
It makes responding possible.
Makes responding possible. Yes.
Not like you were saying.
Not reacting.
And it's that responding that tells us I'm powerful, I'm capable of choosing versus being stuck where I am.
I'm stuck, or I have to fight, flight, or freeze. If we're running from a mountain lion, it's pretty obvious what that looks like. If we're feeling overwhelmed at work, or we just had a disagreement with our partner, that might look like yelling, or it might look like running out of the room, or slamming a door, or getting in your car and driving off, right? Like that's fight, flight, and freeze, which we really didn't address there, but deer in headlights, freeze. We have to soothe our nervous systems to get out of that part of our brains, right? So as long as we're in a state of fight, flight, or freeze, we're using a different part of our brain than the brain that can be responsive, that can be thoughtful and intentional and think through consequences and all of our higher order thought, it's literally a separate part of the brain, right? So if fight, flight, or freeze is activated, I can't activate my ability to choose. So we have to soothe the physical body in order to turn back on this other part of our brain.
So, what would be some specific practices, things that you would say, okay, for the person who's trying to learn what is healing, how do I heal, how do I feel something different than what I've been feeling, and they're hearing us talk about how you could get all the information in the world, but it's not until you experience something that you're gonna that knowing is gonna go into that experiential knowing that really changes things.
Yeah. One of the tools that I use the most is one that I also think might get me the most eye rolls. It does get me the most eye rolls. I don't think it. I know it. And that is concentrating or being aware of what's happening with your breath. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
If you tune into your breath right now, what do you notice about what's happening with it?
It's what I'm noticing is my chest rising a little bit and then coming down, rising a little bit and coming down.
When you inhale, where do you notice, without modifying or changing anything, and no judgment of whatever your answer is either, how far into your body does your breath go right now?
Feels like it comes down to like here.
Below your collarbones. Right there.
Yeah.
Which is further than most people, I think, would say. You're also like clearly a very grounded person. Can I lead you through something really quickly? Which I think people can also follow along with. Okay.
Yeah.
So no judgment of anything that comes up, or if it feels weird or feels awkward. See if you can exhale all the way fully, and then hold the bottom of your exhale for just a moment. And when you inhale, take your next inhale and imagine that your breath is going all the way down your throat, past your collarbones, past your ribs, and is filling up the space behind your belly button. Then hold and release from the belly button and exhale back up in the same direction. So when you inhale, you're inhaling all the way down behind your belly button as if you're filling up a balloon, and then exhaling to release the balloon, emptying from behind your belly button and pushing the air back out of your nose or your mouth. And so you do this a few times, and you might start to notice very subtle shifts in how your body is feeling, which you also might notice have some effect on what's happening in your brain. Mm-hmm. No pressure. And it's okay if you say, I literally feel nothing. What did you notice?
The first thing that I noticed was that my posture had to change, actually, in order to be able to feel that the breath is coming all the way down to my belly. How I was seated before was kind of like it couldn't get below my chest. So then, like, changing my position, then I was able to bring it in, and it wasn't a like, oh wow, this feels really different, but there is a change of feeling a little bit more relaxed, feeling a little bit more at peace. Everything's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of. So what I just heard you say is, first of all, it wasn't accessible with how you were initially sitting. Me either. As I started to lead you through that, I was like, okay, I need to like position myself here to be able to breathe. Just kind of a wild thought. And the second piece is, it wasn't like it changed everything. It wasn't big, but it was subtle, and there was something there. That's one of the tools that I personally use the most and that I teach the most. I think part of what makes the breath piece very powerful is that there's two things we can get from it. One is that it's like a thermometer on how activated we are if we're feeling overwhelmed. The more overwhelmed I feel, the more shallow my breath will be. So sometimes I'll talk with folks and I'm like, where is your breath going? And they're like into my throat and no further. And so if we can start to pull that breath down, it starts to relax. What actually starts to do is it activates the soothing part of your nervous system. The other piece is you can use your breath to soothe your nervous system, right? So that's important. I feel like there's not really any limits to how important that is, being aware of your breath and being able to tune into it. And that's a tool that is always accessible. I tell folks, I'm like, I do this multiple times in a session, done it multiple times since we've been here today. It's like I am constantly coming back to it, and it's a practice because we forget it unless we're intentionally trying to bring more awareness there.
I can notice if it's breath or maybe different parts of my body can be constricted or tense, and then intentionally releasing that, settling into relaxed position. It's aided by the breath. Being able to breathe means that I'll actually be able to relax those muscles.
Right.
Which is what I just experienced.
Mm-hmm.
I love how you ask, where is the breath? I know that, literally the air is getting into our lungs, but that feeling of where it is or how far it's getting, is that a muscle thing? Like where there's
question
constriction or where it's not expanding?
I don't know the answer to that. That's a really good question. Because you're right, like obviously the breath is getting into our bodies. It has to be. But if we don't feel it, perhaps what it is actually more a reflection of the rhythm of the breath as opposed to the muscles, right? So if my adrenaline is pumping my breath, I'm breathing faster and I'm breathing more shallow, like getting little hits of oxygen, right? As opposed to if I'm relaxed or if I'm, for example, preparing to fall asleep, your breath slows down, it goes deeper into your body, it soothes the system, but your breath is also like slower. And maybe that's actually what we're observing is that my breath is really rapid, and so it becomes shallow, as opposed to my breath is fuller and it goes deeper.
Yeah. What do you say to people or how do you help those who've had bad breathing experiences, where they've been told to breathe or breathe deeply and it didn't go well or didn't help?
I empathize, sit with them in it, and I also will own I get it. I thought this was bullshit too. There was no way, if somebody would have told me when I was crying, leaving work every day, breathing was going to have any sort of an effect, I would have told them they had no idea the type of stress I was under.
That makes sense.
It's like, you gotta be freaking kidding me. It's almost offensive. If you think breathing's gonna do anything for me, you have no idea what I'm going through. And so I try to humanize that as much as possible. I get it. I so get it. If we can approach it through a curiosity lens and just observe with no expectations tied to it that it's going to do anything, because you know what? Maybe it doesn't do anything for you today, but the connection is there.
So as we're talking about this, I am imagining how, in sort of a metaphorical sense, breathing in the air, getting it in deep into our body, it's providing this cushion. It's providing a buffer in the minute little interactions that we're having or things that we're thinking or feeling to set us up to respond versus react.
Exactly. It's not going to change your life the first time you do it, right? But if I, over time, connect with it as a way to ground myself, to release any little tension that I might be holding, or even just become aware of oh, wow, whatever it is that I'm sitting with right now is a lot because my breath is all over the place. That's good information to have, right? So it doesn't become the cure-all. It becomes a tool that maybe works for you and maybe it doesn't. Even acknowledging, I know that this seems hokey. like, bear with me. Let's just see what happens. And I think it starts to create this experience of curiosity, which is deeply ingrained, I think, in probably how all of us approach therapy, but certainly in how I approach it is there's so much curiosity.
Let's give it a shot and see. I love that. I think that idea can be so helpful for whatever the thing is that someone's going to try out and experiment with. There's, I feel like there's so much more that I want to ask, and then also talk about all the details of what it looks like and what people can try out, the variety of things that people can try out. For now and for today, is there anything that you're feeling I really like for people to know, or I'd really like people to hear?
It's a good question. I don't know that there is anything that I want people to know. I hope that people will experience instead of knowing, if you know what I mean. Like, instead of like, give me more content, I hope that people will try to experience instead and explore the connectedness of their physical body and their mind.
For people to find you, you'd say counselingwithkaty.com?
Yeah, that's my website. You can find me there. And I would love to connect if anybody wants to connect.
Awesome. Well, I enjoyed connecting with you so much today, Katy. And I do hope we get to have many more of these conversations.
Yeah, me too. Thank you.